We're there. Hello, everybody. Here we are on take 2 of our live Google Hangout number 3. It was completely my fault yesterday. I apologise to those of you, particularly if you had tuned in especially for it. I'm so sorry. I will tell you later what happened. I'm going to use it as an example of something. Yeah, I'm so sorry. But Badria and I, Kasia is unable to be with us today, but Badria and I are here, and it was great we could find another slot in our diaries to schedule this for our last. Hi Badria, good to have you with us. Here we are on our final live hangout of this course. It's been great this week. There's been lots of comments, lots of engagement. We're of course not finished yet. This is kind of the middle, I suppose, of the week. So Badria and Kasia and I are looking forward to your continued comments and views and opinions. And it's been great to share and to read those. And it's just been such a privilege for us to have so many people from so many countries contributing their thoughts and their ideas and comments on the kind of the basic things that we've offered to then engender discussion and debate. So thank you to those of you who have participated in that way, and for those of you who maybe haven't made a comment but who have just been reading, we hope that you have gained something from that as well. So we had a few questions that were posted, and thank you for those of you who posted questions. As in previous weeks, we're going to try to discuss possible ideas connected to your questions. Please remember that we are not sitting here in Glasgow thinking that we have all the answers, and we're not suggesting either that Scotland has all the answers, but we are sitting here acknowledging that the issues we've discussed are issues for us all, wherever we are, and that we believe that by sharing and discussing ideas, thoughts, opinions, experiences, research and so on, that's how we believe we can actually take forward practice for everybody. So Linda Murphy asked 2 questions in one, and we're going to talk about some of the issues that Linda raises in those questions. Linda's first question was, do you think inclusive pedagogy is made more difficult within a system based on frequent testing, such as that which exists in England? Now, for those of you watching from out with the UK, Scotland is one of 4 nations that makes up the United Kingdom: Scotland, England, Wales and Northern Ireland. And for historical reasons, each of these countries has its own education system, its own way of working. And Scotland has a devolved parliament, which meets in our capital city, Edinburgh. And as part of that, education is part of that devolved arrangement. So Linda is talking about the UK, but within one nation of the UK. And so it's a very particular context, but I think the issues that Linda is raising through that question about testing and about how and if inclusive pedagogy can sit within that kind of framework or agenda is one that probably applies to us all. So thank you for your question, Linda. I suppose as we've thought about this, I think where the focus becomes the test and the test results, then I think pedagogy that supports those ends might be more likely to be adopted. And there's that kind of well-known phrase, we just teach to the test. So if you know you're going to be tested in something, you know you want your young people or whoever it is that's going to do the test to get good results, then you teach in a way that will get those results, or you teach what they need to know in order to get that particular result. And certainly, I think as I've kind of reflected on your question and thought a little bit about the English context that you're talking about, I guess you're talking really about the standards agenda, which is heavily connected, I think, to this idea of testing. And I suppose if we look historically, then the testing agenda did probably start in the late 1970s. The then Conservative government sort of made that move towards education becoming this notion of being a marketable commodity, gave increased powers to what it saw as the consumer. And that then saw, I guess, that competitive edge coming into schools, a competitive ethos, because we had league tables where you could measure how well schools were doing. So without going too deeply into any kind of history lesson, I think probably that standards agenda is actually still alive and well. And of course, at the same time as education was being driven down this kind of standardised agenda road, marketable commodity, etc., we also had the whole big debate from the late 1970s, 78, with the Warnock report here in the UK that did affect the whole of the UK and not just England. But we had the whole debate around integration and inclusion, and we've certainly in this course tried to suggest these are two different things. Integration is not inclusion. Integration is putting something into a system and getting the something to fit the system rather than making system changes. So at the same time as we had the standardised agenda, I think we had this integration inclusion discussion going on as well, and that became kind of enmeshed, I guess, in the changes to the system that we have. And actually in all of that debate in the 70s and the 80s, there was no definition given as to what inclusion actually was or is. And maybe that's where some of that tension lies. Inclusion is complex. I think we've been trying to say that through some of the discussions, through some of the activities we've asked you to engage in. It's certainly, I think, linked to issues of social justice, for example, but at the same time you have this standards agenda that's linked to accountability and to achievement, trying to measure. So perhaps the tension and thinking about how we reconcile that tension is key to answering your question. And the second question that you posed, which was, how can teachers be more inclusive within such a system? Well, I think there'll be varying answers to this, from those who think that theoretically it might be possible, to those who just actually wouldn't know where to start to try and make this happen. And maybe these two kind of almost competing agenda, well, perhaps they should be compatible. To be inclusive, all children should appear within the standards agenda. But when the agenda narrows and focuses perhaps on what a particular idea of achievement is, and how we measure that, then there is maybe a danger. I think too, achievement for some young people will be very different for achievement for others. I'm thinking here, for example, of our master's students, who yesterday, the master's students are studying here with us in Glasgow, doing a course, programme on inclusive education, research, policy and practice. And last week we visited a mainstream secondary school to find out more about how this particular school was supporting young people in their learning. And this week the students visited a school for young people with severe and complex learning difficulties. And when you're looking at some of those children in relation to achievement, you know, achievement may be a certain kind of response. It may be some kind of life skill that they have learned and achieved. And yet the standards agenda perhaps is looking for test results and so on. So that there are many tensions, I think, within this system. But the drive for a more standardised agenda across the globe is very interesting. And although the comments I've just made relate particularly to England, since that's the context in which the question was asked, you're maybe watching this sitting in somewhere that's not England. But I would argue, as I say, that the standardised agenda across the globe is one that we all need to think about. You can read more about how the Sustainable Development Goals are going to be monitored through, for example, the report written by the Technical Advisory Group, the Thematic Indicators report. And I'd like to read something from that. It talks about the post-2015 education targets highlight that enrolment and participation, for example, in early childhood development programmes, formal schooling or adult education opportunities are the means to attain results and learning outcomes at every stage. For example, school readiness for young children, academic competences competencies for children in primary and secondary education, functional literacy, numeracy skills, and skills for work, global citizenship, and sustainable development for youth and adults. Indicators for global monitoring must emphasise this renewed focus on outcome measures. The Technical Advisory Group proposes indicators that enable the measurement and comparison of learning outcomes at all levels of education. So you can see there that they're wanting to monitor how our big goal is going to be actually achieved. But if we break some of that down to see what it actually means in detail, so 4.1, goal 4.1 says that by 2030, we're going to ensure that all girls and boys complete free, equitable and quality primary school and secondary education, leading to relevant and effective learning outcomes. So I gave that example earlier of a child who smiles at you, which is a huge step forward for that child. Is that what we mean? And is that what this will mean by an effective learning outcome? It's going to think about that in terms of the percentage of children who achieve minimum proficiency standards in reading and mathematics at the end of primary and lower secondary. And the indicator, it suggests, requires the development of a global metric for each subject as a reference point to which different assessments, national, regional and international, can be anchored. Assessments at other levels, for example, grade 2, could be considered. So I suppose one of the questions I have is within that then, well, what about young people who are marginalised, who are excluded for a whole variety of reasons, as we've discussed on this course? Where do they stand? How will we measure success for them? By 2030, we want to build up and upgrade education facilities that are child, disability and gender sensitive and provide safe, non-violent, inclusive and effective learning environments for all. Again, a great goal, but I do find myself asking what lies behind some of the terminology there. We're going to look at, the document says, the percentage of schools with adapted infrastructure and materials for people with disabilities. And it suggests that major preparatory work is required to develop an approach on assessing school conditions for people with disabilities across countries. Now, I think, as we've seen from comments on this course, as laudable as these are, they might not be enough to ensure that education is inclusive, equitable, and of quality. So, how can teachers be more inclusive within such a system? Well, our feeling is that we have to focus on learning and teaching, on developing skills and attitudes within our young people, but also within our teachers that seek to include rather than exclude. That's what many of the activities on this course have been asking us to think about. Schools shouldn't have to choose between being kind of warm, cuddly, fuzzy, nice places to be, where we value children and accept them for what they are and accept differences, versus the kind of hard, academic driven institution that has top results. I think if we separate these things out, it's not helpful. I think it's false. And I think we need both of these bits. I think we need to take account of the needs of learners. We need to know and understand about learning and teaching and learners. And I think when we do that, we'll create inclusive classrooms where we bring together the very best of what we know about how we raise attainment and achievement, along with how we actually take account of learners and learning. And we bring those together where we are also bringing together the inclusion agenda and bringing it with and putting it together with the standards agenda, where they'll meet and impact on each other. But I think as I've looked closely at these goals that we're trying to achieve, as I say, very laudable goals, I am left with questions about how we actually achieve that. Another question related to notions of assessment and to testing, and there's a difference there, I think, between assessment and testing. Testing tests, and assessment, I think, really ought to be actually about what learning and teaching is about. We need to assess in order to better understand, in order to improve teaching and learning, assessment for learning. But Michelle has a question here that I'm sure is on the minds of many parents, but also many teachers. Michelle says, my question is, my youngest son is going into his last year of primary school, year 6, in September. He will spend most of his time doing revision and testing for his SATs. These are SATs are national exams, again within the English system. I'm thinking, Michelle, that's the context you're speaking in. But regardless of what country you're in, there's these kind of big high stakes tests that your son is going to have to sit. We as parents are told that this is mainly to see how well teachers are teaching and for government league tables. Again, that's that standard agenda coming up here. So if this is the case, how do I stop my son from stressing out or worrying about the outcome of his results as the teachers go on about different levels? That's a huge question, and I think there's many aspects and layers to that question. I suppose I would want to work with the school as a parent to try and minimise the stress. A stressed pupil is not really going to be able to produce their best in any test kind of situation. We know that when you're in a test situation, anxiety kicks in, your brain ceases to kind of think straight. You know, if you're told some really distressing news, or you're in a state about something, you know, we have phrases certainly within our English language where you say, "Oh, I'm just not thinking straight," and that's true. You're not. And I think when we're in that highly anxious state, then thinking straight in order to think, what's the question asking me? What do I know about what the question's asking me? How am I going to construct my answer in order to answer that question in the way that the tester wants? We're just not going to be able to do that. So I would like to think, and perhaps this isn't what's happening, but I would like to think that teachers want their pupils to do well in tests. I would like to think that teachers want to minimise stress. I would like to think that certainly teachers are very interested in the health and well-being of their young people. And knowing that that's important, I would want to know how as schools and parents together we can better support the health and well-being of pupils, because ultimately I think that will get you to the point where you want to be, where your young person is able to do as well as they can in the test at that time, and who also they're doing what the school want them to do, which is giving it their best shot as well. I said I would explain a little bit about what happened yesterday, because I think the example from yesterday in some ways maybe links to what I'm about to say, because what I wanted to talk about was failures. One of the other big things, of course, is that in our education system, certainly in the global north, by and large, we want to pass. It's all about passing. We don't celebrate failures. Although somebody told me recently in, I think it was Finland, they have a National Failures Day where they celebrate failures, and I think that rather appealed to me. In fact, I may have mentioned that in week 1. But anyway, this idea of learning when you fail. I learned something yesterday, and I won't ever make the same mistake again. And what I learned was that I was new to Google Hangouts, okay? So I had never done a Google Hangout, I'd never been part of one, I'd never been involved in one until we developed this online course. And I've mentioned John and Craig before, and you know, they've just been great. And as part of that, they said, "Oh, do you want to do a live Google Hangout?" And my first reaction was, I don't know, because I'm not actually sure what it is. So they explained what it was. I watched one in one of the other online courses I was engaged in, and I thought, oh, that looks really interesting. That's quite, it's been really interesting to see the person that was involved in writing the course and to hear them talk about ideas. And isn't it great that I can ask a question and then this person talks about it, not necessarily giving an answer, but raises the questions and the issues. And so I thought, yeah, discussed it with Badri and Kasha, and we thought, yeah, we're up for this, we'll give it a go. And so the first couple of times that we did the Google Hangout on the first run of this course, John and Craig were here, and they made sure I pressed all the right buttons, and everything was great, and it all worked really well. And the third one we did it on our own, and Badra and I and Kasia were all pleased, it all worked, and that was great. If you've been following these, you'll know that week 1, no problems, worked really well. But week 2, we had a bit of an issue where every time I tried to open up the Google Hangout, it just closed down my whole system, and I had to reboot it and all sorts of things. And so I was a bit concerned yesterday that this was going to happen again. And so I thought, I'll do a little test. And having done my little test, Badria, who's sitting monitoring all of this and telling me if there's any questions that people are asking, said, Margaret, it says that's the Google Hangout over, after I had done the test. And I thought, it does? Oh my goodness. So I immediately lifted the phone and phoned John in a panic. And John said, yeah, it's over. We'll have to reset it. It's not a problem to reset it, but it does mean that we'll need to tell everybody that we're going to have to reset it. So I tell you all of that just by way of illustration, that sometimes when we fail at something, then we also learn from that failure. Now, it just happens that's what happened yesterday, and I'm using that as an example, but there are many examples, I think, where when we have failed at something, we learn through that failure. And of course, the way our system is set up is not set to let that happen. Your question about your son, I think we need to be ensuring that learners feel confident, that learners see learning as a process. And it is something that we will sometimes maybe not do so well at, but it's how we come through having not done well. Do we come through that wanting to have another go, or do we come through that totally demoralised, never wanting to touch it again? I've certainly learned a lot from my mistake yesterday, from my failure of being able to work the system. And it won't happen again, because I now know that from experience. I suppose, I don't know, many of you perhaps watched on television the day just recently when the astronaut Tim came back from being on the International Space Station for 6 months, and there was great excitement here in the UK because he's from the UK, and lots of school children had been interacting with him while he was in space, and his school that he attended were all sitting watching him landing and seeing how he was when he came out, all kind of wobbly because he had been without gravity for 6 months and so on. And I heard him interviewed, and I slightly paraphrase, but he talked about the fact that he left school with 3 not very good A levels. That would be the English national exam. And his advice was, he said, I've just come back from space. Don't let anyone tell you that you can't do things. I think we need to separate results from people, and we need to ensure that people have resilience and know how to deal with failures and know how to learn. And so what can be done with your son? Then I think very much offering him support and working with the school to try and help him. Another question that came in. Sylvester, you talked about what should be done for developing countries to successfully implement the Education for All concept. You talked about learners sitting on underneath trees, and about tools to assess and resources and books and so on. And I think what perhaps we've been trying to argue here is that while systems and structures are undoubtedly important, where we need to look and examine how those systems and structures support us to support learning, we do, I think, at the same time need to think very carefully about teaching and learning and young people within these systems too. In terms of location, maybe it's about looking to see, although children are still sitting under a tree, are there ways that we can turn that opportunity into learning, a learning opportunity? Can we use what's round about us in a way that engages young people in learning, that helps them to become literate, to become numerate? Is it about being underneath that tree, what they can see round about them in a way to help them learn. I think for me, developing countries need to develop in a way that is right and appropriate for them. If you've had a chance yet to look at the activity on contextualized pedagogy that Michelle Schweifert here, who works here in Glasgow, talks about, then I think it's about not transplanting ideas from the global north into the global south, or from a developed country into a developing country, but looking to see how theory can emerge from developing countries, from their own situation, in ways that make sense and are appropriate for the learning and the learners and the teachers in those countries too. I think too often we try to put into place things that the whole kind of what works best, and let's just copy that, I think is not always terribly useful. And certainly I don't think you can transplant ideas whole scale. I do think countries, whether they be developed or developing, need to look at ideas and say, well, how does that apply in my context? What does it look like where I am? How does that fit with our culture? How does that fit with society? And how can we, keeping the child and the young person at the centre, how can we better develop our pedagogy? I'm going to come back to the resources question, Sylvester, because Fiona asks a similar question. Fiona, I'm not sure what context your question, or what context rather you work in, and therefore what context your question arises from. But you ask about practical tools for teachers to assess students with special educational needs, especially in schools when limited resources, there's limited resources and personnel. And I guess, to be honest, that could be anywhere in the world you're asking about that. And then you ask about what books, resources and websites are out there to address inclusive education, especially in developing countries. So I was left not being quite sure where you are, but in some senses, maybe that doesn't matter. I suppose one thing I was thinking, Fiona, is that it does maybe depend on the purpose of assessment. Is it to gain a diagnosis, or is it to make learning better? And I think those are two very different reasons for wanting to assess a student with special educational needs. If it's to make learning better, then we would often argue that actually schools are the holders of a great amount of knowledge and information about the young person that they deal with. And maybe it's about thinking about how we bring all of that together and how we then use it to inform our learning and to inform practice. I think we have a huge amount of information from teacher observations, a huge amount of information that parents can bring, because parents will bring information that's not always in a school context. They see children in a range of contexts. So finding out what are they like in other contexts. There's a paper that we get our students here in our inclusive education course to read about a young person, and the paper looks at this young person, and they have it starts by saying that this young person has some learning difficulties, but interestingly, when you look at the young person in different contexts, the closer the young person gets to school, the more pronounced the learning difficulties are. The further away they are from school, the less learning difficulties, or the less difficulty their learning difficulties appear to present. So there was something, the argument is that there was something about the way school was structured and what we were asking the young person to do that seemed to actually exacerbate, if you like, the difficulties. So teacher observations, pupils' comments, the own learners' comments about themselves and their learning, parents' observations, peers in the class, also huge holders of a lot of information, looking at what the young person is giving you back, if they're writing in jotters or any kind of work that they've done. And using all of that, I would argue, will help you to better assess. There's also, I'm assuming since you're part of this course, you have access to being online, and there's a plethora of checklists out there that will help you to identify, if it's about identifying. However, I would say that as with any checklist, use with caution. Checklists mean you go in looking for specific things, I do know, I've worked with a young person where the school had used a checklist with the best of intentions, and had decided that this young person was in fact probably on the autistic spectrum. And they called the mum to the school and said, you know, we think your son, actually they thought he had Asperger's syndrome. They said, we think he has Asperger's syndrome. And the parents said, I had no idea what that was. All I heard was the word syndrome. And I heard nothing else the rest of the meeting. So I think let's never underestimate the power of our words when we're working with parents. She said, I heard nothing else. And she said, I'm kind of smile now when I think about it. But the first thing I did was went home, got onto the internet and asked the question, is this terminal? Because she had no idea what it was. And the school had used the checklist, and because they'd been able to tick, you know, I don't know, 10 boxes out of 12 or whatever, they were using it to say, we think. Now, that's not to say that the school didn't have legitimate concerns about the young person in terms of they were worried about the way the young person was engaging in their learning. They were trying to understand why the young person was engaging in their learning in that way. But I would suggest that using a checklist like that was not actually particularly helpful, and actually probably in this case actually the young person was seen by a psychologist and so on, and was actually in fact a highly able young person, and that's where it becomes difficult, because the characteristics that appear on one checklist will also start to appear on another. So you get that kind of grey zone in the middle. So there are such assessment checklist type things out there, but I would urge you to use with caution. It's a bit like when you read a medical book, you begin to think of every illness as you start to tick off things on the list in the medical book. Certainly it depends again where you are, but often certainly in my context here in Scotland, assessments, formal assessments, such as WISC tests or tests and so on, would be used by psychologists. So you have someone who is trained, if you like, to use those assessments. So there's a kind of layer of things. But for me, it's as I say, about bringing all this kind of information together in order to better inform learning. And tests are obviously very, can be culturally bound, and all the issues around tests as well. So we need to think, perhaps think holistically. In terms of resources, I think resources are often seen as a barrier to inclusion across cultural, geographical areas, economic boundaries. I get phone calls from schools, what resources should we buy for highly able young people? And I think sometimes, I'm not saying resources aren't important, please don't think I'm saying that, but I do think sometimes that it's not always about looking for more resources. Now, I'm not saying that more resources aren't always welcome, but it's not always about getting more resources. Maybe it's also about thinking about what we have and then thinking about using it in a different way from how we've been using it. I remember vividly the first time I visited a school for young people with severe and complex learning difficulties. And it was way back in late 80s, early 90s. And computers were just a big new thing. And, you know, schools got one computer. And I remember being really interested to think, how can I use this computer? How can I use these discs that we were given with this computer? How can I use them? And I went along to visit a school for children, young people with severe and complex learning difficulties. And in my head, somehow I was going to see something very different. I was going to see different resources. And the first thing I noticed was that they were using the same resources as I had in school. They had the same computer, they had the same discs, they had the same reading books. And I was a bit kind of taken aback at this, and I thought, okay, so what's the issue here? And as I spent the day in the school and as I watched the teachers using those resources, I realised they used them in a very different way from the way I was using them. And I came back to my school and my classroom, and probably I wouldn't have used these words then to describe what I did, but what I did was to start to look at my pedagogy. And I think for me, when we start to think about resources, it does bring me back to the issue of pedagogy. And I think, of course, when we talk about resources, I think resources are often divided into human resources. So how can we better use the people we have access to? the material resources, which often does mean we talk about money, and then also access, I think, to information and to knowledge. And so when I think people are looking for resources, I think we need to think of them in those kind of three ways. But once we've got all these resources, supposing we had this magic wand that suddenly we had this huge pile of money, and we had a huge pile of people, and we had a huge pile of pile's probably not a very good way to describe people. We had a huge group of people, and we had a huge pile of information and knowledge. I'm still left with the question, how do we use that? And so people's attitude to those resources and the way we utilise them, I think, is very crucial in the promotion of inclusive education. There's a really good website that might be worth at least having a little look at, the Enabling Education Network. And there's a page on that that challenges, looks at the challenges of implementing inclusive education and basing their work on their own observations, on some of UNESCO's work, and on one of the writers in inclusion, Mel Ainscow, looking at his work as well. Bringing all of that together, they highlight some things that I thought was worth sharing with you. They argue that teachers and pupils are in fact the greatest resources available for promoting inclusive practice. This is true, they argue, in all contexts, and the particular website I'm quoting here says, but is perhaps more obviously the case in impoverished rural areas in Africa and Asia, where school buildings are poor, teaching materials are scarce, and teachers have little training. They talk too about building on existing practice, looking at lessons learned through things like the UNESCO project from 1998 that Mel Ainscow was involved in, thinking about ways of making better use of local knowledge and building on existing practice, that notion, as I mentioned, of contextualized pedagogy. They also argue that teachers invariably know more than they use, and the idea of helping teachers to bring what they know and what those around them know to becoming better reflective practitioners, and to build upon and develop what works and indeed what doesn't work. Why did it not work? And then beginning to help teachers take responsibility for their professional development. This page also talks about schools as problem-solving organisations, and it quotes Ainscow. It's an old quote now, but he talks about schools being places where teachers and pupils are engaged in activities that help them to become more successful at understanding and dealing with the problems they meet. And this idea again of collaborating, of coming together in order to take learning forward in the context of what they're calling collaborative problem solving, and that would include involving young people that we're trying to support, those who might be described as having special educational needs, or those who are excluded and marginalised, actually involving them in the process. And then looking as well, the final thing it talks about as well is examining the practice of what they call ordinary teachers, looking at the practice of that kind of what's going on in the classroom in order to understand how we can make classrooms more inclusive. So very much involving young people, children participation, tying into ideas, of course, of rights of the child to pupil participation and so on. Now, some of those ideas can be quite difficult to implement when the culture of the society is that young people are kept over there. We can sometimes achieve it very well in schools, so pupils can participate very well in school, but when they come back to the village or the community, their involvement is less valued, or the knowledge they bring perhaps is less valued. So there are issues here for education, but also for society as well. I think we also need to involve parents, and we also need to work with the community. So very much, I think, in order to engender and develop inclusive classrooms, it's not only down to the teacher. There is a real need for working together and for collaboration across different groups and different groups of people, including the learners, the parents, the community, and the teachers. Michelle asked a question specifically about the example that we used from Scotland, talking about the school where there was a great example of breaking down barriers. But on a practical level, how does the funding work? Doesn't the funding follow the child? And if you have a transient population, in other words, children coming in but also leaving very quickly, are there funding implications there? I've got to be perfectly honest, Michelle, and say that I'm not really sure I know the answer to that question in relation to funding. I think if you want to find out more about funding, you will find the answer to how schools and children and young people per capita, etc., is worked out on the Scottish Government website. I think your question, though, does tie to the question that Patricia went on to ask, which was about how long, again, about the same scenario that we used, how long are some of these children at school? What measures are in place when some of these children have to move to another part of the country or another area? The school seems to be such a welcoming and friendly place. And I guess the implication is there that you move from that kind of school and you go to a school where they're not working in that way. And I suppose my answer to that is I've kind of broadened it out beyond just the example in the on the activity to thinking about the issue that you mentioned, which is really about the idea of transitioning. And transitions are difficult times, I think, for any child. Indeed, in the way that school systems are structured, you often have a year, certainly in primary or elementary school, with the one teacher. And at the end of that year, you move to the next teacher. And I know that for the last few weeks, there's been great excitement, great anticipation in many households and many schools in Scotland as they have waited to hear who they are going to get. In other words, who is going to be their teacher next year. And of course, if you've had a good year with a teacher that you've clicked with, that things have been great, and then you've had a good year. If things have been less good, then a year's been a long time with that teacher. So this notion of transitioning at any point is I think a difficult time. I was talking, I have a children's choir that I'm involved in, and I was talking to one of our primary sevens, that's our last year in primary school, and they're moving on to secondary school, and she was telling me one of the things she's worried about is going to secondary school and changing class. When the bell rings, everybody comes out to change classes, and if you're in a big school, we were in a school last week of 1,500 pupils, and that's a big number of bodies moving around a building at any one time. I've not stood up, but I'm not very tall, and many of the pupils in that school last week were way, way taller than I am, and so I can understand that concern about moving. So many things affect us as we're transitioning from one change to another. Never mind starting to think about changing schools and changing geographical areas and cultures and all sorts of things. So I think for me, the answer rather, or part of the answer certainly to your question about this idea of how do these children cope is actually just about good communication. I think the passing on of information is, and preferably in advance of a young person arriving in the new place, is really important. But if it's not there before them, then certainly arriving very closely after them is very important. So systems that allow for that transfer of information, I think, is important, because then you can use that information to plan for how you're going to help that young person to make the transition into a new school, a new class, a new culture, or wherever it is. And I guess communication actually at the root of many of the issues around how we support young people. So helping young people also, I think, to be resilient. When young people are secure in themselves, when they know how to approach new situations, then perhaps that also helps them at a time of change. So I think there's things we need to look at within a system in terms of communication and access to information and so on. Then I think there's things we need to do with young people, all young people, that help them to develop those skills and coping mechanisms and so on as they face transitions. And we all face many, many transitions throughout our lives. And so this is not just a skill for school, but a skill for lifelong learning. And I think those kinds of things will help young people to make transitions. And of course, the teacher within all of that playing a crucial role. I think that's the end of our questions that you have sent us. Thank you very much to those of you who have sent. Thank you to those of you who are watching live. And thank you to those of you who have tuned in later due to either timing or of the actual hangout, or to busyness, or to being in school actually working with young people. But whatever, thank you so much for tuning in today. This is our last Google Hangout, so on behalf of Badria and Kasia, I would just like to thank you for working with us, for your comments, for your interactions, for your observations. It's been a real privilege for us, and we have learned a lot from just being with you and to reading your comments. There are no easy answers to these big questions that we've posed at the beginning of each week. Does education for all really mean all? There's no big easy answers to how we achieve education for all, to how we achieve that laudable goal that we're trying to meet in 2030. But we do think that by asking those questions, by debating and discussing how we might move towards Sustainable Development Goal 4, just the fact that we've engaged in this for the past 3 weeks, well, perhaps we've taken one, albeit a very small, step towards trying to make that a reality, towards making education inclusive and equitable and of quality for all by 2030. We wish you well as you continue to work with young people in your care. To work with young people, I think, is a huge, huge privilege. Let's make sure that we teach in a way that includes rather than excludes, in a way that brings our globalized world closer to one where everyone is valued. And we do it in a way that is right for your community, for your culture, for your country, and for the young people that we are working with. So, as I say, on behalf of Kasia, Badria and myself, thank you very much for all your contributions. They've been really helpful, really valuable, and really insightful. And I do believe we've all taken a step closer to achieving Sustainable Development Goal 4. Thank you very much.